4. And once more, the big idea here is that changes have influenced the way that we act. That is political, economic, religious, and social changes. The history of our country is embedded within this Constitution. And so as we look at the changes of our country, we can see that reflected in the Constitution, not just in the wording. The wording of the Bill of Rights has changed very little, if at all, throughout our country's history, but the interpretation and application of those amendments has changed significantly. And so as we get into our discussion on civil rights, we'll look at some terms like discrimination, segregation, civil rights, affirmative action, and of course, profiling. And again, we've got to think about discrimination. And it's something that we have to be aware of, that we do, and that we have to overcome as a group. Obviously there's no justification for treating someone differently because of association. But maybe there is. I'm not talking about race, but I'm talking about, what if you see someone carrying a firearm into a place where they shouldn't? You might have cause for reacting differently around that person. I mean, that's a snap judgment, but it might be an appropriate one. I mean, we've all had examples of this. But as we think about our struggle for rights, Bailey had an excellent point when she said that the Bill of Rights is awesome, but the civil rights movement is about getting that set of laws applied to everyone. And that's been a process. And so African Americans, particularly in our country's history, have faced centuries of discrimination. And that means unfair treatment based on prejudice against a certain group of people. That means you've prejudged someone for an arbitrary reason. And African Americans have been the victim of this to a greater degree than many other individuals in our country's history. And it's been a process for African Americans to secure civil rights. And by civil rights, I simply mean the full rights of citizenship, where the 14th Amendment says equality for all. And then it has to qualify that by saying regardless of race, gender, creed, religion, etc., etc. And they have to be so specific because there were lots of groups that did not want this to apply to all. And you may remember the story of segregation. And this has roots throughout our country's history. Segregation is the social separation of races. It occurred by law until 1953 in schools. It remained by law until the 1960s in housing. And to some degree, it endures by custom in today's world. There are still concentrations of various races in cities. There are racial ghettos, meaning a concentration of a certain group of people in one sector of a city. And that's been that way since the beginning of our country's history. But segregation became an important target for the civil rights movement because it was a visible practice that was representative of this feeling of superiority that some had over others. As the Chief Justice handed down his majority opinion in Brown versus Board of Education, he said that social segregation creates a feeling of inferiority in a young child that is not likely to leave them throughout the course of their life. That if we are truly to be a society based on equality, we have to integrate from the very beginning. And so the famous Brown v. Board case ruled against segregation. But once more, a law in the books can be a beautiful thing, but it's only as good as its ability to be enforced. And sometimes the law is just the beginning of the change. And so that's where Rosa Parks became famous. Just because schools were integrated by law, that doesn't mean it actually worked. In fact, many schools around here weren't actually integrated until the 1980s. Dakota, there were some schools where you had to be of a certain race in my lifetime to attend that school. And even after Brown v. Board, there were certain social customs and norms that were still held to be the law of the land. For example, buses. And when Rosa Parks sat in front of a bus, the bus stopped, the police showed up, they forcibly removed her from the bus, which resulted in a boycott of all buses in Alabama. Of course, Dr. King is one of the famous figures in the civil rights movement. One of the aspects of his work that made him so incredible was his commitment to non-violent resistance. This means that folks working with Dr. King would go sit at segregated lunch counters like at Woolworth's in Greensboro, North Carolina, and order food. And they would be told to leave, and the police would come, and the tear gas would be fired at them, and the fire hoses and the dogs, etc. With that came the cameras. And like one of you guys said, sometimes we have to be made aware of how we are in the wrong, and we have to be shamed into acting appropriately. And so that's where a lot of the demonstrations and the sit-ins came in. And one of the most incredible moments in this movement, of course, was the famous I Have a Dream speech, where he laid out an inspirational vision of his hope for the future of this country, where he said that someday, maybe, we can work together. And of course, the beautiful part of this moment is he wasn't the only one saying it. And that message was being discussed throughout our nation. One of the most significant federal laws in the civil rights movement was the 1964 Civil Rights Act. By federal law, discrimination in public facilities, employment, education, and voting registration is prohibited on the basis of race, color, gender, and I'm just defining gender as a notation of the sex of a person, by religion, or even by national origin. And so of these which had the biggest impact, I don't have a specific answer for you. I can just tell you that all of these were significant. Whether it was the formation of the NAACP in 1908 by Du Bois, or the famous Brown v. Board case in 1953, or the numerous instances of sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, or buses, or public spaces, or even that beautiful speech, which when you go to D.C., you got to sit on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. I know it's crowded and noisy there, but you got to just take a minute to get in your own space and think about the big things that have happened there. Because what we need to realize also is the civil rights is not just a historical event. The movement continues. The struggle for equality has persisted, has extended, and is absolutely something you can get involved with today. And while the most famous parts of the movement began with African Americans, again, whether it was Du Bois saying that we need to stand up for our rights, when the prevailing culture of the day was to cast down your buckets where you are, as Washington replied to Du Bois and said, keep your head down and hopefully someday people will be nice to us. But Du Bois said, no, we're humans. And so while the movement, and a lot of the famous moments in the movement began with African Americans, it continues. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 ensured that all citizens would have the opportunity to vote regardless of race. And you might say, wait, I thought this was fixed in 1865 with the passage of the 15th Amendment. But what we have to realize is, like one of you guys said, if people don't want to obey a law, they will find a loophole. They will find a way around it if they don't want to obey a law. During Prohibition, this was demonstrated very well. That people will bootleg in whiskey, sell it in hidden nightclubs, and consume it illegally because that's what they want to do. And so the enforcement of a law can prove difficult. And so it's been revised and renewed. Because even though states have tried to infringe upon voting rights of those who they would hope to suppress, the struggle continues. One attempt to overcome historic discrimination is the Affirmative Action Program. And this was to help historically underrepresented groups by giving them an opportunity. For example, in our application process here at the early college, we seek out, we even have guidelines that require us to seek out underrepresented groups. I'm not just talking about race, I'm just talking about groups of folks. We're seeking students that might not have this opportunity otherwise. And that's what we're looking for a lot in our process. We're seeking folks that can be successful. So yes, we looked at your grades, your ability, your test scores, etc., because we want you to be successful in this program, but we've also looked at to what degree do you need this program versus other students who might need it less. And that's a version of affirmative action. It's designed to make up for past discrimination because when the early college program was developed, what we noticed is there were historically marginalized groups of students who are predisposed to certain paths in life, the cycle of poverty, if you will. And to overcome that cycle of poverty, we began to target young people who could benefit from an opportunity like this. That's what affirmative action is. That's how it works. It's designed to make up for that past discrimination where perhaps folks from our backgrounds have been historically marginalized. And we hope to provide a pathway to success. And so yes, it encourages the hiring and promoting of certain groups of people to give opportunities where they may not have been otherwise. But guess what? There are some who might call that reverse discrimination. Maybe you had a friend who applied to this program whose family was wealthy. And maybe they didn't get in, even though their test scores were better than someone else's. And maybe they felt that was unfair. Maybe they would be justified in that feeling. But that's not the purpose of our program. They're going to be fine. They'll go to Charlotte or NC State or Duke or something. They'll be just fine. But and maybe not, but But what we look at, again, is the big picture. We're looking at a specific targeted group of folks who might not have this opportunity otherwise. And that's going to narrow down the playing field. There was a case in California where a young man had applied to a medical school. His last name was Bakke, B-A-K-K-E. The only reason I know that is because it's the name of the Supreme Court case, because he contested this, and he took it to the United States Supreme Court, and he won the right to attend the medical school at Berkeley, because he said that he had been overlooked and a less qualified candidate who happened to be a minority was chosen in his stead. And he won that case. And so you have to realize that affirmative action was meant to help folks who have been historically marginalized. But it hasn't always gone over smoothly. Continuing struggles. Workplace discrimination, and a lot of this is by default and custom, and we've explored this in American history. There is no visible barrier for women going into the highest levels of power. But has it happened yet? There is no visible barrier for women rising to become chief executive officers of major corporations, but when you look at the numbers, the percentages of female CEOs in this country, very small. There is no visible barrier for women and minorities going into politics at all. But the politicians of our country are still predominantly white men. And so while de jure segregation by law, or de jure discrimination by law have been removed, the customs have a long ways to go. And this one might bring up some strong feelings. Racial profiling. That is the singling out of an individual as a suspect due to their ethnicity. If you identify as an ethnic minority, then you've probably been taught from a very young age to be very careful around law enforcement. I'm just being honest. That's just something you've had to learn as virtue of growing up a minority in this country. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying that's what you've had to learn. To be very careful. To hold yourself even to a higher standard than someone not of color might. And it's unfortunate. I'm not saying that always happens, but it does. Another one that can bring up some very strong feelings. Think of hate crimes. It's unfortunate that we see people discriminated against because of their race, or their religion, or even their sexual orientation, or many other reasons, maybe their gender. And while we've had awareness movements to point out the injustice of this, awareness is the first step. If you know how Alcoholics Anonymous works, awareness is the first step of a long process of recovery. Being aware of an injustice, well, that's where it starts. But actually correcting an injustice takes time. Now, can equality truly ever be achieved? I don't know. That's where I left you guys in American history. I just don't know. I'd like to think so. It's what I do for a living, is try to encourage equality. It's what you can get involved with in your career if you're so passionate. But I really don't know.